First of all, I want to thank everyone for being here today. This is an exciting event for us at Soar.com as we are doing our very first webinar. So welcome and thank you for being a part of it with us. It's been a wonderful journey so far and we have a lot of great things coming. Today we are joined by Paul Allen, who will be the host or the guest of our webinar. Many of you probably know Paul, and he's a dear friend of mine as well. Our focus and topic today is on Soar with Your Strengths, Don Clifton's revolutionary work that in many ways changed the industry that we all love, which is coaching. So I am your host, Andrew Webb, and today's webinar is August 24th, 2018. It's important for you to remember that this is a webinar for you. So for many of you, if you have questions, we need to hear from you. You can ask those questions if you hit the chat button below. I'll be monitoring them, making sure that we're really apprised of what questions or ideas you have. And it's not just going to be one question and answer like traditional webinars. We'll probably break it up in two so that when you have an idea or a question, please give us an opportunity to guide this discussion so that you get to do what you do best, is take this information and go and uplift humanity. You're going to learn a lot today and subsequently in all of our other webinars. But it's important to apply what we've learned. And that's what we try and do to help others. We can also do it ourselves. So my suggestion as we go forward today is as you're listening and something strikes a chord or there's an impactful moment that Paul may help surface for you, identify those key situations in which you are a coach that you might be able to redirect, change behavior, adapt what you've learned, and then write it down. As you write it down, it becomes real and you begin to memorialize what you're learning. Because it's not enough to know more, we've got to do something with what we're learning. So for those of you who are just joining us, I am Andrew Webb. This is Soar.com's first webinar, August 24th, 2018. And I'd just like to now begin by introducing our expert, Paul Allen. So for many of you, you know Paul, and he has spent, I believe, more time than anybody else in this realm diving into the details of Don Clifton's great work, Soar with Your Strengths. And if you talk with Paul, he simply exudes this language naturally, and it's inspiring. And I've watched as he's inspired others with the depth of knowledge he has. Indeed, his knowledge is deep and his passion is profound. Paul, for many, know that he started a company a while ago called Ancestry.com. It did okay, I'd say. It became one of the largest genealogy companies in the world. From there, he worked with Gallup as the strengths evangelist. Because his passion for this content is so pure, I watched as well as many seem to find a way to gravitate towards Paul, learn the power of Don Clifton's initial work, and then go and change other people's lives. On a personal note, Paul and I, this is kind of an interesting fact, share the same 5 themes. So I usually like to tell people that who know Paul because then I get a little bit of credibility. It builds my own credibility instantly. With that, I'm going to actually turn it over to Paul and let him take us on this journey as we learn a little more about Don Clifton's work, Soar with Your Strengths. So Paul, let's get learning.
All right. Andrew, thank you so much for that introduction. It's very exciting for all of us at Soar.com to reach out and connect with coaches all over the world and to work together to make the world a better place. I'm a latecomer to the concept of strengths and the strengths movement. I just joined Gallup in 2012, and sadly and kind of embarrassingly, I was fairly oblivious to the concept of talent and performance and organizational development for all those years that I was building startups, including Ancestry.com. I think the reason, Andrew, one of the reasons I'm so passionate about strengths and what Don revealed and discovered over 50 years of research and interviews analyzing excellence. I think I'm so passionate about it because I was so oblivious to it for most of my career. And when I discovered it, when Clint Carlos introduced me to StrengthsFinder in February of 2012, and then Gallup hired me as a consultant, and then later that year offered me a full-time position in Washington, D.C., I realized how much I had missed out over 20 plus years of running startups and interviewing and hiring hundreds of people. I didn't understand the people that I was working with. And I think the reason I'm so passionate, Andrew, is I don't want entrepreneurs and leaders and educators and well-intentioned people everywhere to make the same mistake that I made, which is to be oblivious to the diverse and unique talents that each person in your world has. And Don, I think more than any other human being, deeply studied and understood the pathways that lead to excellence, the natural patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving that can be productively applied, which every single person has a unique combination of those patterns. And when you start to see the patterns that people have, you start to look at people through a new lens, and you start to have a language to describe things, the world becomes a more beautiful place. I think Don and the hundreds of people that still work at Gallup, who Don trained and mentored and led in these journeys of discovery around talent and excellence, the world is a much better place because of what Don did. And I'm a huge fan of Don. I don't hold a candle to him. I kind of feel, I never met him. I feel a feeling of awe every time I'm with people who did work with Don, who helped with some of his research and helped conduct interviews and analyze the data. And I just love all these people. They're among the finest people that I've ever met. So I'm a big fan of Gallup. I'm a big fan of Don Clifton. And today what we'll do is we'll start running through at a high level the strengths theory that Don first articulated beautifully with Paula Nelson in his 1992 book, Soar with Your Strengths. If you haven't read the book, I strongly advise you to buy it and read it and reread it and reread it, because literally on every page there are gems that represent what Don had learned in 40 years of studying excellence. And as a psychologist, he posed the question, what would happen if we studied what's right with people instead of what's wrong with people? And then literally for decades interviewed top performers in hundreds of occupations to try to find out what made them tick and why were they wired for success in that particular role. So Don is a genius and a pioneer. I actually went to the Library of Congress in 2013 to look and see what was written about Don in the literature, and I found a who's who in psychology, and there were over 600 psychologists listed in this massive directory of psychologists, and sadly Don wasn't in that book. And I have competition number 7, and I actually think Don Clifton should be more famous than Sigmund Freud or almost any other psychologist. And I think now that 19 million people have discovered their Clifton Strengths themes, and I think that's going to grow into the hundreds of millions in the coming decades, I do think that the world will wake up to the realization that Don created this simple theory based on research, and that all of us can be better off when we discover what our natural patterns, our Clifton Strengths themes are. So I'm excited to be a part of championing a greater celebration of Don's work and his life. And I still know very little relative to what I want to know someday about Don's history and his work. But Jim Clifton and the Clifton family have been very helpful to me as I engaged in research about Don, and they were very encouraging. We gave out a copy of Soar with Your Strengths, Jay Miller did, at the 2016 Strength Summit to all of the coaches that were present. And I was privileged. So the book starts with a parable. And I actually think it's kind of cool that a worldwide movement like the Strengths movement began with a simple parable, a story called Let the Rabbits Run. And I actually, this is weird, but when I'm talking about the strengths movement to small or large audiences, sometimes as many as 1,000 or more people, I'll sometimes take 4 minutes or 5 minutes at the beginning of my talk, and I'll read the parable, the let the rabbits run story. Because what Don did in this parable is he took a group of animals, and animals are relatable, human beings like animals, and kind of like to think of animals that they can think and talk and act like humans sometimes. The Disney movies, and obviously there's a lot of popular cartoons with animals, but this parable helps you relate to what the animal's predicament would be if they all got together to build a school, to make them smart like people, and if they had to have a well-rounded curriculum. And the reason I love this parable is that as you read through the little bunny's experience going to school and being really good at running and really good at jumping and loving school because he got to do what he did best, and then on the second day when he's learning to fly or taking swimming class and he realizes he's terrible, he will never be good at that, his parents didn't have to learn how to do that, but the teachers and the counselor and the education system were trying to force this young bunny to be well-rounded. And in the course of that, forcing this bunny to be well-rounded, this bunny was humiliated beyond anything he had ever experienced in his life. And I think that this parable is touching emotionally because each of us know people, and maybe we experienced it ourselves, where we were really good at something in school and we were really not good at other things. And to be humiliated in front of your classmates is really devastating and can cause a lot of people to disengage and even kind of go off the rails. And so the education system is a factory model of education that has standardized curriculum and standardized testing. And a lot of people do not thrive in that environment. And it's not easy for anyone to be well-rounded. In fact, Don Clifton once said, if you ask someone to be well-rounded, you might as well ask them to be dull. Because what we really should do is focus on our strengths and stand out in different ways, figure out what our unique talents are and really develop those so that everybody can see what is possible and we can be rewarded and celebrated for that. So I'm going to run through the first 4 chapters of Soar with Your Strengths just at a high level, and then we'll do some Q&A, and Andrew, you'll be soliciting questions from the audience. And then the second half of Soar with Your Strengths is a really wonderful set of what Don called the 4 catalysts to strengths development. And I kind of look at those 4 chapters as the fertilizer that allows a human being to grow and thrive and flourish. I was looking up on Wikipedia or on some other websites, what do plants need to grow and be healthy and thrive and bear fruit? And there's like 12 elements or ingredients that are required for a plant to thrive. And I actually think in Don Clifton's Soar with Your Strengths, he lists almost all of the ingredients that are required or essential for a human being to really thrive, to really grow, to fully develop, to really flourish, and to really bear fruit. And I think that his 8 chapters are so powerful in helping anyone understand, well, what's the alternative to a strengths-based approach? Why are we obsessed with fixing what's wrong with each other? And then he kind of goes through this sequence that I think is very well thought out. And as I said, 40 years of research on pathways to excellence articulated in this very easy to read book. But those chapters, those final 4 chapters, you cannot ignore them. All of those ingredients or catalysts to strength development are just as important as identifying what the strengths are in the first place. It's not enough just to know that you have talent / potential / patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving that can be productively applied. It's not enough just to know that you have that potential. You actually have to catalyze. You have to develop the talents. You have to turn them into strengths. You have to be able to do what Gallup calls near perfect performance in a certain activity. And so, part of this book kind of lays out the necessary elements. So we'll dive into each chapter just for a minute or so. And then I think Andrew didn't mention this, but we will be planning additional webinars with a full 30 to 45-minute deep dive on each of the 8 chapters over the coming weeks. And we'll end up with 4 or 5 hours of discussion of Don's chapters of Soar with Your Strengths and the research that led him to make conclusions and to make recommendations about human development. So chapter 1 is interesting. It's called Let's Fix What's Wrong, a National Obsession. And so he talks a little bit about why everyone is so obsessed in the education system and the workplace with fixing what's wrong with us. And he talks about it as an obsession. Like, if almost every conversation between a student or between parents and teachers is about what's wrong with their student. Back to school night is not really a celebration of, what's right with your child. You don't usually get called to the principal's office if you've done something right. It's almost always what's wrong. Let's diagnose what's wrong. I think this national obsession, or maybe an international obsession with fixing what's wrong, maybe stems from the history of medicine, is to diagnose what's wrong and try to fix it. The history of psychology is to have someone lay down and psychoanalyze them and find out what's wrong, where did they get messed up, and how can we fix them. And really not a lot of attention. I think Marty Seligman from APA has made it very clear that, and Andrew, I've heard you say this very beautifully, that psychology was only half-baked. If we're only studying what's wrong with humans, then we're missing out on the whole other side of psychology, which is what's right with humans. And so Don not only is the father of the strengths movement, but the grandfather of positive psychology. And that whole new field of understanding what's right with human beings is so refreshing and so positive and so needed. And it needs to spread far more widely than it has so far. One of my favorite quotes as an entrepreneur is that the future is here, it's just not very evenly distributed. That's from the famous science fiction writer William Gibson. So the future is already here, it's just not very evenly distributed. The strengths movement is already here. It's taking hold of individuals and teams and whole organizations, some of which have hundreds of thousands of employees. But it hasn't spread to the 7.6 billion people on the earth. It's only a very small beginning. And so I think that we have to, we'll encounter headwinds almost everywhere we try to take strengths, with people who think it's better to focus on what's wrong and fixing what's wrong.
Paul, let me ask you a question real quick, if I might. You mentioned that there is this national obsession, and later on, people began, especially in the psychology world, to embrace positive psychology, focusing on the bright spots, what we're good at. And tell me if you have any insight. Why do you think it took them longer to catch on from where Don Clifton was for so long? What was the process that finally led to them getting to that point?
Do you know, if you think about it, in the history of ideas that are really good and really true don't take hold immediately. There's always decades of kind of encountering headwinds and resistance, and people don't like to change. And so Dr. Edwards Deming, when he after the World War II helped with Japanese economic recovery and manufacturing processes, Edwards Deming was a brilliant man. My father met Edwards Deming in the 1950s. My dad was an engineering student, and Jim Clifton stood up in front of the coaches at the Gallup Summit this year and talked about how it took 40 years for Edwards Deming's lean principles, his processes for efficient manufacturing with great systems in place to prevent errors, and with all the people side of whatever Edwards Deming taught. It took 40 years for it to become embraced in the United States. Meanwhile, Japan's manufacturing economy skyrocketed. They started taking over many different sectors of the manufacturing world. And why was the United States so slow to embrace the whole principle of lean? And it's kind of like the prophet's not a prophet in his own country or something. So it might take 40 years for a really good set of principles that work to throw out the old principles that, and the myths that don't work. And so Don starts chapter 1 with a whole bunch of myths that get in the way of success. The myths that we've all heard. If at first you don't succeed, try again. You can do anything if you put your mind to it. You know, if I can do it, you can do it. All those myths that just aren't true do so much damage and create kind of this angst and this stress and burnout, like I'm not trying hard enough. If so-and-so can do this, I should be able to do this. And so I don't know, Andrew, I think almost every great idea has taken many years or decades for it to really spread. And I think we're at the beginning of that tipping point where the strengths movement really can spread into schools and workplaces and into individual lives. So chapter 2 is a beautiful articulation of Don's strengths theory, which is that we should focus on our strengths and manage around our weaknesses. Now, a lot of critics of the strengths movement put up a straw man and say, oh, you can't ignore weaknesses. It's wrong to ignore weaknesses. And strengths coaches tell you to ignore weaknesses. No. Don says you cannot make progress in strengths until you embrace your weaknesses, until you embrace your areas of non-strength. He's got a whole section about that. So anyone who criticizes the strengths movement by saying it's unrealistic because we all have weaknesses, Don said you can't even begin your strengths journey until you embrace the fact that you can't be good at everything and stop trying to be good at everything and just focus on what you are good at. So I think if you go back to Don's original theory, you kind of silence all those critics because he does head on. In fact, he's got a quote here. It says, "Those who embrace their non-strengths are those who move on with developing their strengths." He also says, "Claiming weaknesses is the critical step to building strengths. Since weaknesses sap us of our time and energies, they rob us of the enthusiasm we derive from practicing our strengths, from doing what we do best." So he's got 8 steps to identifying weaknesses on page 76. Here's one step to identifying weaknesses: when someone feels defensive about their performance. Another one is when they develop obsessive behavior or experience slow learning. Or if you don't profit from repeated experience in an activity. If that's not helping you grow, then that may be a sign that you have a weakness in that area, not a strength. And if you have to consciously think through the steps of a process, you may not have a strength in that area. If you have unconscious automatic flow when you're engaged in something, that's a clue that you have a strength there, not a weakness. So he also has 8 clues. If you hear yourself saying any of these 8 things, it's an indicator that maybe you have a weakness in that area. So I think it's very powerful. Don has 5 strategies for managing weaknesses. And so any critics of the strengths movement who say we're ignoring weaknesses is just simply ignoring Don. Don's 5 strategies for managing weaknesses, including just stop doing it, just ignore that and do something else instead. One is subcontracting. Find a person or a group that can do for you what you can't do well, and just subcontract it. So get around, you need to get something done, just find somebody to do it for you. Another one is a complementary partnership where the 2 of you can tag team and get things done together that you can't do individually. There's also what he calls support systems, and there are always alternatives. How do you get the thing done, but maybe use a different route to get there? So again, weaknesses, embracing and feeling okay about knowing that you have weaknesses, you'll never be great at everything, is a key to unlocking your strengths journey. And it's essential. You can't do the one without the other. Okay, so Chapter 3 and chapter 4, everyone should memorize the title of these chapters. It's super easy, and you can quote it all the time to everybody, and it resonates with people. Chapter 3 says, find out what you do well and do more of it. I mean, I love that. It's just a simple heuristic that says, find out what you do well and do more of it. Chapter 4 is find out what you don't do well and stop doing it. Why are we spending so many hours and years and even decades of our life doing something we're poor at and we're not getting better rapidly at? Instead, why don't you find out what you don't do well, do less of it, find out what you do well and do more of it. That 10,000 hour rule that Malcolm Gladwell made famous, Don Clifton cites a study from Dr. Bloom in the 1980s that showed it takes 10 to 17 years to become world class at something like chess or swimming or tennis, any kind of a world class performer or athlete, 10 to 17 years. So 10,000 hours, if you spend 10,000 hours doing what you do well, guess what? You are going to be so excellent at that, and you'll stand out, and you'll be rewarded and recognized for it. So I do think that Don even talks about focusing not on all of your strengths, but he really advocates becoming excellent at one thing. And he says that all human development, when you become really, really good at one thing, it becomes kind of a structure that you can add other things to. And so really diving into one area of strength and really spending the time and the effort to become excellent in that area, it then opens up other doors where you can add on other strengths to it. But he said sometimes our other strengths get in the way of developing and focusing on one strength that we can be really outstanding at. So I think those are important. Now, Andrew, I hope you're still hearing me.
We are. Yeah, you've been clear.
Okay. Are there any questions or comments about the strengths theory and focusing on strengths rather than weaknesses?
I'm going to let them write some more questions if they have any, but I'd like to follow up with what you just mentioned. You know, there's something pretty profound about taking one thing to avoid that cognitive overload you can be excellent at. And I think Don would love it if we embraced an ability to be known and to know ourselves as one who is in that realm. So let me talk to you a little bit about that, Paul. What are the ways we can, beyond just the strengths language, because often that strengths language can get a little intimidating because it's so intricate and ornate at times. How do you pull it down to make sure that you really understand what is that one thing you can be known as?
Well, I think that the 5 clues to talent that Don identified in chapter 3, which a lot of coaches have been trained on, those 5 clues to talent, you can't ignore them. If you notice moments of rapid learning, if you notice yearnings that you've had, if you've noticed satisfaction that you get from doing something really well, and also kind of total performance of excellence, or if you experience flow state, which actually Mihai Csikszentmihalyi came up with the flow state concept after Don wrote this book, but Gallup has embraced that because that's a clue that you have talent. If you're experiencing flow state, try to experience that as often as you can. You know, I just think we're ignoring all the clues. Don talks about the expectations that society has of people, and we kind of listen to those outside, all the shoulds. You know, we should all be this, we should all do this. You know, and the school systems kind of make you try to be well-rounded, and so I think you have to like consciously say, I'm going to spend thousands of hours doing what I do well. And I'm going to silence or lessen the impact of all those outside voices telling me how I should spend my time and that I should learn this and that I should go to emotional intelligence class and that we all have to be well-rounded in all these different areas. It's not easy to do. In fact, Don says that the hardest part of the strengths theory on page 73 is that our culture wants to fix weaknesses instead of managing them or making them irrelevant. we want to fix them. We want to fix everybody. We want everyone to be good at everything. So that headwind is so strong that it takes, and that's why I think coaches are so needed. When coaches are meeting with individuals, they've been hearing their entire life to get better at something that they're not good at. Mm. And that's from the school system, from the workplace. And so coaches can be your partner to help you break free from those myths that actually do so much damage to your potential as a human being. They at least cause you to waste time on things that you're never going to be great at. And they also often help, they prevent you from discovering the one thing or the few things that you could become excellent at. Mm. And so it's a matter of ROI on the time that we spend learning how to do things and then doing things. Don was obsessed with not studying the average. He always wanted to study the most successful in every role. You don't learn much from studying the average. In fact, one of the things I thought on a plane one time was, GPA stands for grade point average. So here you have a student. I actually have a nephew. He did incredibly well in math and in music and not so well in other subjects. He was probably one of the most gifted musicians in his entire state and one of the most gifted mathematicians in his entire state. But on his college admission, his average scores are being reported, and they weren't high enough to get him into his college of first choice. Guess what? That university missed out on an incredible mathematician, an incredible musician, because they were looking for the average of his grade point scores. I actually think GPA should be reinvented as grade point achievement. What is your highest grade? Let's focus on that. Let's not average all of them. If you're really bad and you get a C or a D on something and it brings down your average, who cares? Why not celebrate the fact that you got a 4.0 in math or a 4.0 in music? And so I think Don would say grade point average is not a good metric. In fact, GDP is not a good metric. There's a lot of metrics that society uses that are not the right metric. Don would say study the success, the excellence, the highest achievement of each person and ignore what they can't do. Mitt Romney spoke at Silicon Slopes in January. He was talking about forming Bain Capital decades ago. And he said his whole theory with his partners was to find people who had extreme skills in certain areas, and they would ignore their flat spots. This is how he referred to weaknesses or areas of non-talent. He called them flat spots. He said, we didn't care if they couldn't do certain things. We just managed around that. I was like listening to Mitt Romney, who built this very successful Bain Capital on the same theory as Don started, the strengths theory, the strengths movement. Don't worry about what people can't do. Find the ones that can do really extraordinary things. It's almost like superhero movies and, X-Men and Avengers, and everybody's got their superpower. Well, let's find out what each person's superpower is and focus on that.
So given that, and perhaps pendulum has swung and coaches may have even been fearful for even using the W word, we can bring it back a little bit and recognize what Don has taught us about weaknesses, managing them. I love what Rhonda said, aggressively managing those. But Lorraine in this chat is asking a great question. We know there are balconies and there are basements, but let's talk about the basement side of a strength. Is that a weakness, even if it's temporary?
So, yeah, I think Don would say that anything is a weakness that gets in the way of the outcome you're looking for. And so if the outcomes are negative, then what you think of as a strength or potentially a strength is not a strength at that point. So, I think that there are a lot of strengths that people maybe dial up too much and kind of ignore the impact on the wider group or the impact on the goals. But see, Don studied excellence and outcomes. All the strengths themes are potentially useful towards getting the right outcome, but it's all about the outcome. So if you're not getting the right outcome, you're not using a strength.
And sometimes, Paul, there are people that don't have this, they aren't versed in this language. They haven't been exposed to the idea of an appreciative approach, positive understanding, and identifying bright spots, like you mentioned. What happens when you're at school, for example? We talk a little bit about school, and you want your children to embrace and to be taught what they do well. When in so many of these teachers are in a deficit-based environment, how do you help a teacher, particularly with your own children, start embracing this language and helping their own children identify strengths?
Well, it's an incredibly good question, because teachers are among the finest people on the earth, and we have all had teachers who've blessed our lives and touched our minds and our hearts. And thankfully, a lot of teachers have high individualization, and they're going to buck the system. But the systems are what's broken. And so it's really hard for teachers and even administrators in schools to buck this system. What we need to do is evangelize the strengths mindset and bring like the Child Development Center mindset of strength spotting for toddlers, and bring that into K through 12, bring that into higher ed. Thankfully, in higher ed, we're seeing literally millions of students taking Clifton Strengths, formerly Strengths Quest, but Clifton Strengths for Students. And so it's starting at an individual level, many millions of people taking it. But even the career guidance and the academic advisory don't always use it. So I think the key answer right now, before we can change the workplace systems and the school systems, is finding the right individual teachers. And I know that's hard to do. It's doable for college students, maybe not so doable for elementary schools. You can't really school hop in a lot of places. And so I don't know. It's really a tough question. I think a lot of people homeschool. A lot of people don't want to subject their kids to certain things. But, you know, those of us who've been through public education, and our kids have, you always have teachers that are, you know, really amazing at maximizing growth. And as Don Clifton said, the most important thing that Gallup was ever doing was making sure there's a teacher in every classroom to help every child feel like a human being every day. Someone to care about each human. So let me segue to the 4 catalysts for strengths development. And when we do a deeper dive on each of these 8 chapters, we'll get questions in advance from coaches, and then we'll actually prepare a more cogent presentation on each of these 8. And we'll highlight certain quotes from Don in every one of these chapters. I'm trying to do a quick overview today of his book and the importance of his book, that we'll do a deeper dive on each chapter later. So the Strengths Catalyst, starting on page 103, chapter 5 says, and I love the titles that Don chose for each chapter. I've already read chapter 1 through 4. Chapter 5 says this, and everyone should think about this in the world of Simon Sinek and Start With Why and purpose and all this stuff. Don saw that purpose and mission and calling was essential for strengths development in the top performers. Chapter 5 is called Strengths Develop Best in the Framework of Mission. I'll repeat that. Strengths develop best in the framework of mission. Each person who can find their calling, their passion, their purpose, their mission, is going to go so much farther than if they don't find that. It's like a laser beam. We all have light, we all have talent, we all have capacity, we all have energy. If you aim all of that talent and energy towards a mission that drives you, that motivates you, guess how far you're going to go? And in fact, Don talks about, under the mission thing, he talks about Peter Drucker noticing that missions sometimes grow thin, but he's got a section that says goals die, missions live on. You know, any short-term obstacles that you encounter when you're on a mission, you're going to kind of fight your way through it. And when you do, your expression of your talents and your strengths is going to become so much more obvious and powerful. It's like, you know, no pain, no gain. When you have a mission and you aim your talents and your motivation about it, you just go so much further and end up towards the outcomes you want. There's a section in chapter 5 called Living Your Mission. Don says, claim your mission, talk about it, enjoy it. He actually said, talk about it to everybody you meet. Like, if you know what your mission is, and I know many coaches do, many coaches have basically taken their strengths and they've woven it into their calling and their mission. They put it on their business card. They put it on their website. They talk about it everywhere. You know, I unlock human potential. I've talked to coaches who have tremendously specific missions, and they wake up knowing that that's what I'm going to do today. When Don noticed that strengths develop best in the framework of mission, it was by interviewing all the most successful people in lots of roles and finding that an insurance salesperson wasn't just trying to sell insurance policies for the sake of getting a paycheck. There were people who were in tears when they were interviewed about their job as an insurance salesperson. They were in tears because they were giving families peace of mind. And some of them had experienced families who had a devastating loss, and because they had insurance, it kind of saved the family financially. And so the very best insurance salespeople, the very best sanitation engineers. I mean, there's a beautiful story in a O.C. Tanner book called Great Work about a janitor or sanitation engineer named Moses who worked in a hospital. And when he was interviewed about what he did, he kept the hospital room clean so that the children could heal. And he had this rapport with some of the patients and their families. I mean, I sat and read this story about this man who cleans hospital rooms, and I was in tears on an airplane, realizing that some people can frame what they do as a mission, and they're going to be so much more outstanding than someone who just looks at it as a job. Okay, so that's chapter 5. Chapter 6 is a powerful realization. Chapter 6 is all about people in your life, and that none of us are successful on our own. Chapter 6 is strengths develop only in relation to another human being. Every one of us who's ever achieved anything or ever will achieve anything in our life, it's because of other people. Our parent, in my case, my mom, my dad. I've got a sibling who brought me into the high-tech world. Brother-in-law who's been a mentor to me. Friends, managers, leaders, teachers, professors. All of us have developed because someone believed in us, cared about us, identified our potential, and helped us start to unlock it. And so chapter 6 is so powerful. Don says that not only do we need great relationships, but he talks about a personal board of directors that each person needs for their whole life. And he wants to know, do your personal board of directors members know that they're on your personal board of directors? Like, isn't this an amazing concept? That imagine someone in K through 12 or someone going into college, starting as they've learned from different teachers and as they get their first jobs, and they start assembling a personal board of directors. I've actually got a close friend who Jim Clifton offered to be on her personal board of directors for the rest of her life. And that was so meaningful. But all of us need other people that are capable, that believe in us, that care about us, who can advise us and guide us on our journey through life. So number 1, personal board of directors. He's got a section under this chapter called 9 Principles for Managing Relationships. And they're very good. We'll cover them item by item in the in-depth follow-on webinar about strengths developing only in relation to other human beings. He talks about what to do about negative relationships. He has 6 clues to failed relationships and strategies for what you can do if a relationship is failing. And so I think that one of the great books that Gallup has published, Tom Rath was the author of this shortly after StrengthsFinder 2.0 came out, is a book called Vital Friends. And if you want a really deep dive on why friendships and relationships cause you to live many years longer, if you have 4 or more high-quality relationships, you live a lot longer. In fact, it's more dangerous to not have close friendships than it is to smoke or to drink in terms of your longevity. And maybe those things go together sometimes, I'm not sure. Sometimes vices come in bundles. And so if you're making bad choices, maybe your relationships break down at the same time. But it's devastating to human beings to not have strong relationships that they can draw from. Family, friends, coworkers, mentors, coaches. We all need others to help us be the best version of ourselves. So chapter 6 is amazing. We can definitely do a 30 to 60 minute deep dive on that. But I recommend Vital Friends to everybody. It's one of the deepest studies in the history of the world on friendships and relationships and how essential they are to human development and flourishing. Chapter 7 is one of my favorites. I think schools and workplaces could benefit enormously from what Don points out in chapter 7. Nothing happens until someone expects something of you in ways you can achieve. Don has this incredible chapter on expectations of self, expectations of others, negative expectations, low expectations, and wrong expectations. He does an analysis of all these different types of expectations and whether they're positive or not. And then he says that all success happens when someone has the right expectations of you, which are high expectations, but based on your capacity. He talks about how we destroy people left and right by having the wrong expectations of them. If a manager expects you to do something over and over and over again, they're just repeating their expectation and you just can't do it. You feel terrible. They feel terrible. Everybody loses. When you have enough insight into human talent and capacity, and the Strengths Finder instrument is so powerful to help you understand what a person naturally can do, think, and feel on their own without even being asked. When you have high expectations that are aligned with what a person has the potential to grow into, that's where growth happens. So Don was obsessed with fit for a role. In fact, he questions the idea of failure. He says maybe there's really no such thing at all as failure. There's simply a misalignment with expectations and what someone's capable of. So the failure in his mind was really in the misalignment of what was required of someone and whether that they couldn't achieve. And so I think that we need to really carefully look at all the roles that people have in our organizations and everyone we coach. What are their roles? What are their objectives? And does each person have the natural talent and capacity to do that role really well? Or are we expecting people to be an Excel guru and they can't ever do that? No matter how many courses we send them to, they just don't have the natural talent to excel in that role. I'm not saying you don't always, you can't always, stars don't align. You can't always have the perfect role for the perfect person. It's a work in progress. We're all trying to job craft so that people are in the right role, that they have strengths, they have energy, they have mission for, and sometimes it takes a while to get to that ideal state. But the closer we get to that, the better off each individual is, the better off each organization is. Okay, one more chapter, and this may be kind of the crowning chapter. I love how Don talks about celebration, the way to recognize good work. I'll just mention a few things about this chapter. He says that individual performances soar when good work is celebrated. There was a person at Gallup that was a data entry employee that was the top performer. And the more they recognized and noticed, the greater her achievement. I think she 6 times her previous monthly record for data entry and just kind of excelled all notions of what one human being was capable of doing. But there's just something about measuring and celebrating good work. You get more of it. I think Don said the fastest way to double or triple productivity is to say something and notice every time good work is done. And Gallup's research shows that I think 2/3 of American workers have received no praise and no recognition in the past 12 months. And so we're kind of missing out on the simplest way to improve productivity, which is to notice good work every time it happens and to say something and to recognize it and to celebrate it. So this chapter is a very powerful catalyst to unlocking strengths. He talks about many faces of celebration, how you celebrate other people, and talking to someone by name, noticing others. One of my favorite gems that I've ever encountered in Soar With Your Strengths is this. every 2- and 3-year-old who's probably ever lived, you'll notice at different times in their life, in their days, they'll say, "Hey, Mom, watch this. Hey, Dad, watch this." Whether that's kicking a soccer ball, playing with dolls, doing something in Little League. And Don said that longing to be noticed, that every child says, "Hey, Mom, watch this. Hey, Dad, watch this," that does not go away as we get older. But we go to the workplace and there's nobody to watch or to see what we've just done. We've just accomplished some really cool thing. We've written a report. We've served a customer. Everything went beautifully. Nobody noticed. So that hunger to be noticed that children have, and that Don says adults, that longing doesn't disappear with the years. So what could we all do in our work environments to make sure that that longing, which all human beings have, is met, that longing is noticed and rewarded with recognition and celebration? I think Don, one of the greatest contributions he's ever made to the world is the "How full is your bucket" concept from 1970, which has spread literally to millions of people around the world, writing handwritten notes, putting them in somebody's bucket or on their desk. And Gallup obviously does this internally, but many other companies, many other schools teach people to write handwritten drops of recognition that will positively fill up someone's emotional bucket. I have a bunch of handwritten notes from Jim Clifton that I can pull out at any time and realize he said this positive thing about me, he expressed this care for me, and that is a motivating force every single time I look at it. And so the idea of recognizing and celebrating. I love this section in this chapter called Recognizing the Right People. He specifically says we shouldn't just recognize the brown nosers, the politicians, the most vocal people, the sugar daddies, or the game players in an organization. He says if you want to recognize the right people, you have to measure what they're doing. You have to count it, rate it, rank it, or target it with binary goals. And then you have this hallelujah, authentic celebration for authentic achievement. This isn't all about everyone's a winner, we're all great, let's hold hands and sing Kumbaya. This is about actual performance. And so celebration and recognition should be based on something that is observable, measurable, and he's got 4 strategies for doing that. He talks about one final thought, Andrew, and then we'll have a couple more questions before we end up. He talks about celebrating your strengths whenever you have an achievement. Giving yourself a personal reward. I know a lot of people who use this strategy, but I don't know if they knew that Don Clifton came up with this decades ago. He said, personal rewards are an important part of strengths building. And here's a quote from Don. Some people call this self-indulgence. We call it strengths building. If you accomplish something, Andrew, and you send yours, you take your family on a vacation, or you go on a vacation to Zermatt Resort, or you buy yourself something that you've wanted for years as a celebration of your achievement, Don Clifton called that strengths building, not self-indulgence. He also says a life filled with celebration is a rich one indeed. And he encouraged people to find every excuse imaginable to celebrate others with notes, gifts, flowers, public celebration with a person's primary audience, their family, their friends. If your employees are doing good things, don't just recognize them in front of, privately or in front of their group. Bring their family and friends to an event and celebrate and recognize them. I actually listen to this song called Superheroes or Hall of Fame almost every morning when I'm running up the canyon. And it's about, doing something significant and being in the Hall of Fame. And I just think, what if every human being made it into the Hall of Fame of something, either in their company or within their family or community, that everyone who did something successful was inducted into a small Hall of Fame to recognize that they did something amazing. I just think celebration and recognition is one of the cheapest resources in the world that would motivate more achievement and create more strengths development than anything else. And it can often be free. It's not always free, but it can often be free. And it's just underutilized. So for me, Don Clifton's capstone of the entire strengths theory is this whole element about celebration and recognition, which I think we can all spread that message far and wide. as part of the other side of the coin of strengths.
Paul, I love how you captured Dr. Clifton's ultimate message in our shared human journey. I think what I'm hearing is that when we're able to embrace and claim who we are naturally and build upon it, not only are we developing ourselves, but suddenly we have the capacity to look beyond ourselves. It isn't self-absorbed, but suddenly we can go and celebrate our shared humanity and those who are around us, their small works or large works, wherever they may be. There is obviously a time crunch for us, but I do have one question that I think is really important, and this comes from Paige, as she's anxious to kind of go back to this, and we'll just end with this last question for you, Paul. She says, I often hear that strengths are our values in action, which I think is a great terminology. It harkens to another great assessment that identifies strengths. Can you explain how you'd break that down? If our talents are innate, and often our values and mission are learned, or we develop them through our life, how do you break that down?
You know, that's a really interesting question. I think there's, character strengths, there's innate talents, there's personality, there's values, there's life experiences, there's decisions, there's hard work and realizations of, what works and what doesn't work. I don't think I can boil it down simply. I just think that human beings are extremely complex. We have 100 billion neurons and 100 trillion synaptic connections. Some of the brain scientists are now trying to map the human brain in such a high resolution that you'll be able to see every brain signal, in 50 years, just like the human genome has been mapped. So I don't really know how to answer that question, except that each of us is a combination of lots of things. I think plants need 12 things to grow. I think human beings need at least 20 things to grow, including an understanding of our innate talents, including discovery of what our core values are, including the people in our lives, the opportunities to try things, the hours of effort required to determine if we're good at something or not, and then the psychological state of flow and when we're doing what we were born to do. And so it's a great question that I can't really kind of give a simple answer to. I'm not really as much of an academic in terms of understanding theory and psychology and neuropsychology as I am a promoter of something that I have found to be a very positive, uplifting instrument and concept. And so there are some great academics out there, and I do read scientific literature, but I'm not in that educated realm myself. And so I like to shine a light on what is true and what works and what's helpful and positive. And the whole values and motivations thing is, I'm still learning a lot myself. I think, Andrew, you've actually been trained and certified in many other strengths instruments. Do you have
yeah,
how would you answer that?
I would. I'll tell you, if you go look at some of the earlier academicians and really leading scientists, the one I'm thinking about is the father of neuroplasticity. That would be Eric Kandel, who ultimately found out that our minds and brains, more importantly, are malleable. They are plastic. And this neuroplasticity is, according to Eric, this is what he says. He says, the potential for plasticity of our brains is what endows each of us with our own individuality, meaning our experiences can and ultimately don't define us, but necessarily they are what can define us based on how we filter them. And then our brains respond in a way that create, I think, those values, create the ways we filter the world. He found out that our minds are malleable and that neuroplasticity takes place when he started working on, if you believe it, sea slugs of all things, because it simplified the neural and synaptic connections in a way that they could study potentially far more than they ever could in the human brain. But the principles were the same, and ultimately he won the prize, the Nobel Prize. So
Andrew,
go ahead.
Andrew, let me just mention, so on page 98 of Soar With Your Strengths, Don Clifton specifically answers the question, do people change? His answer, typically no, but there are exceptions, transformations. he talks about a slovenly young man who wouldn't comb his hair, and then he cleaned up and changed his life. A 30-year-old executive who was drinking, partying, then became a father, and how that transformed him over the years, how that father's self-image changed, and there was now little chance for the previous weaknesses to take hold after a lifestyle change. Don says, don't expect your spouse, partner, etc. to change. If they do, it's a bonus. I mean, it's kind of like that for us. Like, I think Don studied the vast number of successful people and found that their neurological pathways were pretty solid and didn't change a whole lot. But he's saying that there are some rare exceptions. It's just not common. You can't just wake up and say, I want to be like this. I want to be super organized and disciplined. And so, boom, I'm going to become that. Like, your biological and neurological systems are pretty kind of wired in one way. So while I do believe in neuroplasticity as a possibility, and there are probably ways to catalyze that too, I think that largely we have some innate behaviors and patterns of thinking and feeling that are pretty habitual and that are reflected in our neurological wiring. So it's not impossible to change, but it's so much easier to take what you're already naturally good at and leverage that and, you know, use that instead of trying to be something else. That's Don's message.
I think that the key word are those habits that we have neurologically ingrained. I think that was a great point, Paul. Way to go. You know what? With that, I'm going to say we are past time, but I want to thank everybody for joining us. This recording, just so you know, will be available to all pro coaches. We will email those and also post them for them to access at any time. I have loved seeing your questions and engagement. Please don't forget to register for our next webinar, which is coming out on September 5th on asking better questions. This is a great segue we just talked about. It's about the science of inquiry and perhaps why we are making this far more of a difficult of an issue as coaches than we need to be. That will be a great session, and I'm anxious to see your guys' input on that as well. Paul, as always, that was wonderful. We have learned a lot and been edified. Thank you so much. And I guess now we'll just say we'll see you next time.